The Atlantic magazine has published fresh messages from a group chat among top US officials in which they discuss specific operational details of plans to bomb Yemen. Brussels has warned that Russia must fully withdraw from Ukraine before European Union sanctions on Moscow can be lifted. This is being seen as a blow to Donald Trump's hopes of striking a quick ceasefire deal. Bangladesh's head of the interim government is set to hold his first meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on Friday, underscoring growing ties between the two nations as diplomatic tensions simmer with India. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza protested against Hamas in a rare sign of public dissent aimed at the group. The anti-war demonstrations marked Gazans' frustration with Hamas's handling of negotiations with Israel after nearly 18 months of the war. Focus. US President Donald Trump has announced 25% tariffs on imported cars effective April 2nd. Now, the new levies mark an escalation in Trump's trade war against top US trading partners and allies. Mexico and Canada, remember, were among the US's biggest automotive suppliers just last year. Trump says the duties would prompt companies to manufacture in the United States, though analysts say the extra import costs could be passed on to customers. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described the move as bad for businesses, worse for consumers, while the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, labelled it a direct attack on Canadian workers. You must note that stocks fell ahead of the announcement, the latest sign of market trepidation over Trump's rapid-fire trade policy. But the auto duties are just an appetizer for the broader reciprocal tariffs Trump plans to unveil on the 2nd of April. Many reports are cautioning. Just listen in to what the US president had to say, followed by the Canadian Prime Minister's reaction.
But this is very exciting to me. This is the automobile industry, and this will continue to spur growth like you haven't seen. Before I was elected, we were losing all of our plants. They were being built in Mexico and Canada and other places. Now those plants largely have stopped, and they're moving them to our country.
President Trump announced 25% tariffs against our auto industry. And this is a direct attack, to be clear, a direct attack on the very workers that I stood in front of, uniform workers I stood in front of this morning at the Ambassador Bridge.
Well, live from Vietnam, we have with us Mugdha Mishra, who joins us with the CEO of Lumax Autotech. Mugdha, so Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. Take us through the impact this will assert, and will India suffer?
Well, so the bigger point here is that the tariff is not just on auto, but also on auto components.
Right.
And while India does not import as many cars, export as many cars into US, but our auto component export to US is substantial. It's around $3.5 billion, and it's just in the first half of this year. It was over $3.5 billion. So you can see that it's a big, important industry, and as it was till last year growing at 9 to 10%, expected to grow at 20 to 30%. But what India auto component can take heart in the fact that China is getting more penalized. So that's the reason why probably India will end up having a little bit of an edge. But to talk more about it, I have with me Mr. Vikas Marva. Hi, Vikas, can you hear me well? All right. My first question to you: how do you see this tariff, and how do you think the trajectory will be, and what is the immediate impact on Indian auto component suppliers?
The scenario is still emerging, and I think India is not intended to be on the hot list as per the news that we are getting. But still, if you see the composition of Indian exports and largely going into North America and US in particular, it is relatively less in terms of the automotive sector. They are like practically negligible in terms of vehicles, and even in terms of auto components, it's fairly low. So it's my personal feeling that we should have a very minimal impact owing to US being a small export market for us.
But it was showing great growth till last year. Do you think that will get impacted? However, the fact that China was a bigger supplier and has got bigger tax tariffs now will probably somehow help India. Do you think something like that could happen?
So you're right. There was a scale-up happening, but then overall, if you see, there could be reciprocal agreements. The situation is still not very clear, and we are waiting to hear the final news. But even then, India would be comparatively expected to be better placed than, let's say, Canada or a Mexico or a China in terms of being able to export there better.
Donald Trump said that these tariffs are permanent. That was the last statement that he gave. Do we see a probability of governments negotiating with, U.S. government negotiating with each country and having a different tariff structure? And that might mean, because India has been till now with Donald Trump and Mr. Modi being constantly in touch, do you think that will help India a little bit?
Well, India does share better relationship with US than most countries on the hot list or the radar right now, and India has shown a positive inclination to lower the tariffs by even reducing duty on some high-end motorcycles. So I think it will be a very evolving kind of a situation, and we haven't heard the last on it right now. So we will have to wait and watch as far as the automotive sector is concerned.
But interesting times, news coming in every day. Thank you so much, Vikas, for joining us today.
Meanwhile, in other crucial news, the White House is continuing to try to downplay the security blunder made when a journalist was added to a group chat about plans to bomb Houthi targets in Yemen. The White House reacted furiously after The Atlantic magazine published messages between national security officials in a Signal group chat in their entirety. Donald Trump called the reporting all a witch hunt and declared the publication a failed magazine, but it comes after The Atlantic magazine published what it says is a timeline of war plans shared by Trump officials in messages on the Signal app that mistakenly included its editor. Well, Democrats are calling for both the Defense Secretary and National Security Advisor to resign. But just listen in to what the US President had to say, followed by a report from Washington by my colleague, Kate Fisher.
Hegseth is doing a great job. He had nothing to do with this. Hegseth. How do you bring Hegseth into it? He had nothing to do with it. Look, it's all a witch hunt. Here we are talking about some of the greatest business deals ever made. The greatest companies in the world are moving into the United States, and you want to ask about whether or not Signal works. I don't know that Signal works. I think Signal could be defective, to be honest with you.
Well, Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth has reiterated that no classified information was shared on the chat, but screenshots of the thread posted by The Atlantic show him giving specific details of timing and the weapons used. The Atlantic decided to release them after President Trump and members of his government accused the editor of lying, and because of their repeated assertions that the information was not classified. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that President Donald Trump, quote, continues to have confidence in his national security team. And that was in response to a reporter's question on whether anyone would be fired over this. But several Democratic lawmakers have been calling for resignations. During an Intelligence Committee hearing on Capitol Hill, Democrats criticised the administration for not acknowledging that it was a mistake or apologising, and called for those resignations. At the hearing, administration officials insisted the chat had not included classified information, and Democrats disputed that, while Republicans acknowledged that it had at least included sensitive information. Well, the top Republican and Democratic senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee are now asking the White House to expedite a Defense Department review of the incident. Kate Fisher, NDTV, Washington.
Well, you must note this is not only colossally incompetent, but a scandal of the first proportion. Top US officials, including the Vice President and Secretary of Defense, discussing the most sensitive information on a commercially available app that is both easy for foreign adversaries to penetrate and seemingly designated and designed to circumvent the public records law that allow for scrutiny of their policy communications. But for further clarity, live from Washington, D.C., we have with us Daniel Block. Daniel, as always, thanks so much for making time for us. Stephen Miller's suggestion of extracting economic gain from allies like Europe, it raises the big question, is this a realistic and ethical approach to global diplomacy? These chats have revealed so much. Does it reflect a more transactional, what's in it for us mindset that actually undermines long-term alliances as far as US's approach is concerned?
I think that's certainly a huge concern in Washington, particularly among Democrats and the remaining parts of the Republican Party that have not bought into Trumpism. That European allies are going to see this, other US allies are going to see this and think they can't trust the United States unless they are able to sign on to some sort of protection racket. And I think what's particularly jarring about this in particular is two things. First, it suggests to the Europeans and again to other US allies that this is not just something Trump is saying publicly, but that this is privately what the administration thinks as well, because these are private messages they did not expect to be read. And second, I think in terms of the United States trying to maintain its alliances, you now have serious concerns. You had concerns before, but now you have even more serious concerns among allies that if they share intelligence with the United States, it will not be in safe hands for exactly the reasons that we're talking about right now.
Daniel, also given the contradictions in these leaked chat logs, where Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had opposing views on foreign policy, does this indicate a fundamental lack of direction in Trump's foreign policy?
I mean, the Trump administration has always been known for having contradictions and being contradictory and often having policies that are contradicted by what they say their aims are. Now, of course, to be fair, every administration has disagreements and every administration has policymakers and senior officials who don't see eye to eye. So that in and of itself is not necessarily atypical, but with Trump, it's always magnified to an enormous degree. There's always more fighting. There's always more disagreements. There's always more contradictions than there are during a quote unquote normal presidential administration.
Well, we'll wait and see how this unfolds and whether the White House continues to downplay this. Thanks so much, as always, Daniel, though, for joining us on NDTV. With that, let's turn our attention now to the neighborhood. Well, Bangladesh's interim chief, Mohammad Yunus, will be on a 4-day China visit. He's going to embark on his first state visit. Do remember, Bangladesh's Mr. Yunus is expected to meet China Xi Jinping amid strained India ties. And Dhaka and Beijing are expected to sign pacts in trade and economy. In fact, the foreign secretary in Bangladesh has said China is Bangladesh's closest ally. For further clarity, we have with us strategic affairs expert Brahma Jalani on the broadcast. As always, sir, thank you so much for making time for us and joining us on NDTV. Bangladesh, it seems, is keen to position itself as a business hub for Chinese investments, especially in the manufacturing sector, as we're given to understand. Do you think it'll be tricky for Bangladesh to manage to attract Chinese investment without alienating its regional partners, particularly India?
Mohammad Yunus is in a difficult situation. He has been close to the Democratic Party elites in the US. The Biden administration blessed his coming to power. In fact, the Biden administration had been targeting the Sheikh Hasina regime, and they enthusiastically welcomed the regime change in Dhaka. But since the coming to power of Trump, Yunus finds himself in a predicament because Trump had, just before the presidential election in November, issued a strong statement about the persecution of minorities in Bangladesh. Also, Yunus himself has a record of making anti-Trump statements. When Trump won the presidency for the first time in 2016, Yunus publicly bemoaned Trump's victory as a black day. So Trump's return to the White House has created disquiet in Dhaka. They believe that the US administration under Trump might squeeze Bangladesh, and Yunus therefore has embarked on his first bilateral trip by going to China yesterday. Ironically, yesterday was Bangladesh's Independence Day, and he left for China at 1 p.m. On a very important day for Bangladesh.
So, also regarding Mr. Yunus's request for a meeting with Prime Minister Modi ahead of his visit to China, it raised questions about India-Bangladesh relations. But what does the delayed Indian response indicate about the current state of diplomatic ties between our two countries?
It's difficult for India to host Yunus at this stage, given the fact that the human rights situation under Yunus in Bangladesh has become quite dire. Yunus regime has released violent Islamists and terrorists from jail. The persecution and killings of minorities continue. Yunus's terrorism tolerating regime has released 174 major militants, major terrorists, many of them convicted terrorists or terrorists who were under trial, terrorists who were linked with the ISIS-linked JMB, for example. In addition, hundreds of death row convicts and militants remain at large after escaping from prison. Look at the situation in Bangladesh. Even the army chief who played a key role in the regime change last August, he publicly admitted last month to quote unquote, we are going through a chaotic situation. This is the army chief talking about chaos in Bangladesh. Given those realities, how could India be inviting Yunus to pay an official visit to India? In fact, the dilemma for India today is whether Modi should meet with Yunus on the sidelines of the upcoming summit in Bangkok. This is the BIMSTEC summit, which is going to take place in a few days from now. And New Delhi will have to carefully weigh all the different factors to decide whether there should be even a meeting on the sidelines between Modi and Yunus.
As always, sir, thank you so much for joining us on NDTV. We'll be keeping a close eye on Mr. Yunus's touchdown in China and also on how New Delhi reacts to a meeting with him. In other news, Indian film censors have blocked the release of critically acclaimed film Santosh over concerns about its portrayal of misogyny, Islamophobia, and violence in the Indian police force. Santosh, which is the UK's official entry in the Oscars International Feature category and a BAFTA nominee for Best Debut Feature, has been blocked by Indian film censors. It's written and directed by British Indian filmmaker Sandhya Suri, and the film was made in India and is in Hindi. Now, according to a report by The Guardian, the Central Board of Film Certification refused to clear the film over concerns about its negative portrayal of police, depicting deep-rooted misogyny, discrimination, also the normalization of mistreatment and torture by police officers. But the filmmakers had previously submitted the script in order to film in India and had faced no issues. You must note that India's largest cinema chain was also on board to distribute the film in January. With that, let's turn our attention now to South Korea, which is facing snowballing damage from some of its worst ever wildfires that have killed at least 24 people and forced nearly 30,000 people to evacuate. The blazes have destroyed a 1,300-year-old Buddhist temple, houses, factories and vehicles, and burned nearly 40,000 acres. Well, hopes are now pinned on rain that is forecast for today, but with less than an inch expected, the situation could remain dire as far as South Korea is concerned. And to Turkey now, where Istanbul's opposition-run municipal council elected an interim mayor to run the city after Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was actually jailed pending trial over graft charges that he and his supporters deny and call politicized. Authorities, by the way, have arrested more than 1,400 protesters, including numerous photojournalists. They are clamping down on coverage of a movement that Mr. Erdogan describes as evil, but which is driven by anger at cumulative political repression and the parlous state of the economy as well. You must note that the next presidential election is not due until 2028 there. Slipping into a quick break, back in a moment with much more. Do stay tuned.
The India-US strategic partnership is one that's been developing now over the last several decades, and there's a great sense of optimism over here in India that it is headed in a particular direction. To tell us a little bit about that, and there are so many important global events taking place, Tulsi Gabbard with us, the Director of National Intelligence. It's wonderful to have you here in India, and thank you so much for speaking to us. In terms of the strategic relationship and the intelligence arrangements between India and the United States, to what extent is it premised on perhaps an expansionist or an expanding China and the Asia-Pacific region?
You know, the ties between our two countries, the United States and India, go very, very far back. And so what we're continuing to see is a strengthening of that partnership and recognizing that the mutual interests of both of our countries are centered around peace, prosperity, freedom, and security. So now as we see a new administration coming in with President Trump's leadership in the United States, of course, Prime Minister Modi's long-standing leadership here in India, we have two leaders of our two great countries who are very good friends and who are very focused on how we can strengthen those shared objectives and those shared interests.
So in a sense, it's taking forward what we already have in terms of the strategic partnership, and that's one of your primary goals, right?
It is.
And how were your meetings to that end?
It is. I've been having great meetings, and of course this began with Prime Minister Modi's visit to President Trump in Washington, D.C., very shortly after he was inaugurated back into office for a second term, where they really set the tone and set the vision for where a stronger U.S.-India partnership and friendship can lead to. And so my visit here is really predicated on the work that has already been done, and I've been having great conversations with my counterparts here in the Indian government. I just met with the Minister of Defense a few minutes ago, and looking forward to visiting with Prime Minister Modi here later today.
And you met the Prime Minister in Washington as well some time back. How did that go? I mean,
it was,
we saw the pictures.
It was great. I had the opportunity to meet him several years ago. It was good to see him again, and it was actually very perfectly timed, where it was maybe 1 or 2 hours after I was officially sworn into this position as Director of National Intelligence that he arrived in Washington, D.C. and had the opportunity to welcome him back to the United States.
Yeah.
I've been reporting on all issues, big and small, from Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, rest of South India, bringing you all the action, all that you need to know, all that you want to know.
The energy of Maximum City is infectious. I bring in that energy in our news coverage from financial capital Mumbai.
Covering from the southernmost part of India over the last 23 years, I bring in-depth and 360-degree coverage from the Dravidian heartland.
The land of Mishti is also known for its bitter politics. I have seen much water flow under the Howrah Bridge, covering Bengal in all its vivid colors.
How often have you turned away from debates that descend into endless fights? We bring you a show where every question is answered, where every debate finds its resolution, where every story finds its conclusion, where opinions collide but facts prevail, where stories unfold with insights and trust. When the noise ends, the last word begins.
A quick update from the UK now, where Rachel Reeves is facing backlash after the government's own assessment said that benefit cuts will push 250,000 more people into poverty. This includes 50,000 children in the UK. They are now set to impact 3.2 million families. Angry critics contrasted the Chancellor's austerity cuts for the poorest to recent controversies over her acceptance of £7,000 from a friend to buy clothes and also free tickets to a Sabrina Carpenter concert. Thank you so much for watching this edition of The World 24/7. As always, we'll keep tracking the latest for you. Do stay tuned.
In today's interconnected world, India's voice is more crucial than ever. When India speaks, the world listens. At NDTV World, we are that voice, bringing you intelligent and insightful news from India and beyond. From geopolitics and diplomacy to economic shifts, migrations, tech disruptions, and the stories of our diaspora. We cover the news that shapes our global future. NDTV World, your new home for global news is here.
ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए और ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए।
अरे ये क्या है?
ये आपकी रक्षा के लिए और ये घर की रक्षा के लिए।
न जले न पिघले, घर घर को सेफ बनाएं। अपार अणुशक्ति फायर प्रोटेक्ट वायर।
Do you really know the company you invest in? What is the real picture behind presentations and claims? Is the outlook as rosy as the company claims? Know Your Company, powered by NDTV Profit Research, shines a light on the biggest stock market movers.
The India-US strategic partnership is one that's been developing now over the last several decades, and there's a great sense of optimism over here in India that it is headed in a particular direction. To tell us a little bit about that, and there are so many important global events taking place, Tulsi Gabbard with us, the Director of National Intelligence. It's wonderful to have you here in India, and thank you so much for speaking to us. In terms of the strategic relationship and the intelligence arrangements between India and the United States, to what extent is it premised on perhaps an expansionist or an expanding China and the Asia-Pacific region?
You know, the ties between our two countries, the United States and India, go very, very far back. And so what we're continuing to see is a strengthening of that partnership and recognizing that the mutual interests of both of our countries are centered around peace, prosperity, freedom, and security. So now as we see a new administration coming in with President Trump's leadership in the United States, of course, Prime Minister Modi's long-standing leadership here in India, we have two leaders of our two great countries who are very good friends and who are very focused on how we can strengthen those shared objectives and those shared interests.
So in a sense, it's taking forward what we already have in terms of the strategic partnership, and that's one of your primary goals, right?
It is.
And how were your meetings to that end?
It is. I've been having great meetings, and of course this began with Prime Minister Modi's visit to President Trump in Washington, D.C., very shortly after he was inaugurated back into office for a second term, where they really set the tone and set the vision for where a stronger U.S.-India partnership and friendship can lead to. And so my visit here is really predicated on the work that has already been done and
A very good morning. You're watching NDTV 24/7. This is the Breakfast Show. I'm Divya Wada. We have a whole lot lined up for you, including the BJP chief of Tamil Nadu, who's here in Delhi. He's expected to be meeting with Amit Shah. We'll get you all the details. First, let's get you the headlines. The Chief Justice of India has, in fact, put out a message to the lawyers saying we need to ensure that we do not collapse. These are the remarks that are coming in the backdrop of the judge cash rouse